What if there was a religion that threatened both Christians and Muslims so much that its followers were persecuted on 3 continents? Manichaeism, the belief in the struggle between light and darkness, flourished from Rome to China, but was wiped off the face of the earth. For 1,500 years, its books were thought to be lost forever. But 20th century archaeologists did the unbelievable. In the desert sands, they found what the authorities had tried to destroy. Today, we'll uncover the mystery of a religion that empires feared and find out why its ideas still stir people's minds. If you are interested in the forgotten pages of history and the secrets of lost civilizations, subscribe to the channel and like this video. And in the comments, write what you think. Could the religion of light and darkness survive in the modern world? Or was its dualism doomed to defeat in the face of monotheism? Share your opinion. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. The secrets of Manichaeism, shrouded for centuries, still excite the minds of researchers and fascinate ordinary viewers who come into contact with this mysterious religion. What caused the disappearance of an entire doctrine that, in the distant 3rd century after the birth of Christ, pierced the world of that time like a ray of light? Manichaeism arose on the eastern borders of ancient Persia, when spiritual turmoil and doubt shook the foundations of powerful empires, and humanity was puzzled by the eternal question of the meaning of good and evil, light and darkness. What did the prophet Mani feel during his first revelations, when he, a boy from a Mesopotamian tribe, had a vision of unknown worlds and a message from the living Paraclete? Why did his words, woven from bright knowledge and unwritten sounds, first melt the hearts of his listeners, and then, decades later, become sedition for the authorities and the priesthood, worthy of burning and merciless oblivion? What was the threat of this new view of the nature of the universe, in which the struggle for the salvation of the soul took on a cosmic scale, and the goal of freeing the captive spark of light became a lifelong mission? Manichaeism absorbed many ideas, from ancient Iranian dualism to the heated spiritual debates of the Christian East. It became a worldview for thousands of people in different lands, from the sands of Babylon to the walls of Rome, from the velvet twilight of Sogdiana to the foothills of China. Why did every authority, when confronted with the teachings of Mani, declare war on him, mysteriously sensing a threat hidden in the harmonious definitions of light and darkness? Throughout the centuries, experts on Manichaeism have called it the only extinct world religion, and the fragments of texts that have been found still fill scholars with awe. What if they hold the key not only to the fate of a vanished people, but also to the meaning of human history? Let's take a closer look at the origins of this vanished faith, where the prophet Mani was born, how his word became a challenge to civilizations, and why, even after 1,000 years, the fear of Manichaean fire remains in the memory of cultures. Where does the mysterious path traced by light and darkness lead? Will the attempt to uncover the secret of Manichaeism reveal a new mystery? And are we ready for this knowledge? How does modern science still find traces of the Manichaean cult in forgotten sands and darkened papyri? Would you like to know what price the Manichaeans paid for their choice and what answers they sought, challenging time itself? The story of Mani begins where the ancient Mesopotamia and Persian territories meet, giving rise to a special atmosphere of searching for true wisdom. No witness can say with certainty when divine inspiration descended upon Mani, but tradition tells us that he was a gentle man, far from the pursuit of power, who lived in a settlement among the valleys of Upper Mesopotamia. The boy, who experienced loneliness at an early age, often went to the banks of the Euphrates, watching the changing surface of the water and listening to the incomprehensible voices that sounded in the night. What lies behind the legend of the appearance of Paraclete, the messenger of light, who brought young Mani knowledge of the two principles? The legend says that when the darkness of night enveloped the earth and anxiety thickened in the air, the boy felt inexpressible fear and hope at the same time for the first time. The purity of this experience remained with him forever, and already in his youth, he tried to describe his feelings in words that those around him did not understand. He spoke of the battle between light and darkness, that every person is a battlefield, and that nothing can reconcile the contradictions. It was Mesopotamia that became the place where Mani formulated the foundations of a new faith. From here began his long journey as a teacher, prophet, and wanderer, carrying the spark of revelation through ruined cities and dilapidated shrines. His first sermon, delivered in villages and castles, was met with distrust. Local rulers feared the penetration of new ideas. Too strong was the fear that the power of light could destroy the foundations of those who were accustomed to ruling in darkness. Why were Mani's words so dangerous? Their essence was that every person is capable of finding the truth themselves if they reject false dogmas and listen to their inner voice. The Manichaeans did not worship idols or build magnificent temples. Their teaching was a path of inner purity, strict discipline of the spirit, and constant searching. All this made the teaching vulnerable, but also extremely influential. It attracted those who disagreed with the official faith, those who thirsted for the truth hidden behind a veil of lies. In the following chapters, we will learn what trials Mani faced on his path of preaching and why his teachings became the cause of the most brutal persecution that lasted for centuries. Where was the line between light and darkness in Mani's own soul? Could he have foreseen the fire that his revelation would ignite centuries later? The answers are hidden in time, but the threads of true history are already beginning to emerge from the darkness. Manichaeism struck the ancient world with the extraordinary simplicity and depth of its ideas. Its main principle is dualism, the confrontation between two eternal principles, light and darkness, unfolding on a cosmic level and in the soul of every human being. The Manichaean universe is built on a mythological contradiction. The world of light, full of purity, order, and goodness, clashes with the world of darkness, which represents chaos, suffering, and alienation. Is there a boundary between these worlds? Or is the war between them ongoing in every heart? The Manichaeans believed that the primordial light was eternal and inviolable, but darkness, a conglomeration of passions and chaos, suddenly encroached upon its boundaries. As a result of the battle, part of the light was imprisoned in the material world, and it is the task of man to free the light imprisoned within himself by overcoming evil, ignorance, and passion. Imagine, every movement and action in life is a small step toward great liberation. What a challenge it is to keep the light from fading, to prevent it from dissolving into darkness. Manichaean cosmogony is filled with allegories. Divine figures battle the demons of darkness, and Mani's mission is to remind people of the inner battle that is invisible to the eye, but felt by all the senses. Manichaean teachings are strict. The liberation of light is possible only through spiritual purity, discipline, and the rejection of temptations. It is not surprising that the authorities and traditional religions perceived these ideas as a threat. Pause for a moment. What if each of us is engaged in a battle of the magnitude depicted by the ancient Manichaeans in their mysterious scrolls? Perhaps unraveling the essence of this bright mystery means coming closer to the salvation of the soul? In the next chapter, we will delve into the mysteries of the sacred texts of Manichaeism, learn why they were burned in almost every corner of the world, and how modern people are trying to restore lost knowledge. Are you ready to open the first page of the Book of Life? At the heart of the Manichaean worldview are mysterious sacred texts known as the Book of Life, the Gospel of Mani, the Shaburgam, the Psalms, and other works created by the prophet and his closest disciples. For many centuries, these books were a source of inspiration for followers, but they also became the cause of brutal persecution, as they were considered a secret weapon against official dogma. Why were the authorities so afraid of Mani's writings, and what was hidden in their pages? The Manichaeans had a special attitude toward texts. Each fragment was considered a living manifestation of light. It was believed that reading a line brought a person closer to liberation, and that creating a manuscript was a ritual equivalent to worship. But with the advent of persecution, the Babylonian libraries were looted, and the books were publicly burned. Much knowledge was lost forever. Over the centuries, the surviving manuscripts were passed down from generation to generation, sometimes in the form of mysterious codices encrusted with symbols that only the initiated could understand. Our time has become an era of amazing archaeological discoveries. In the sands of Turfan and in Egyptian necropolises, fragments of ancient Manichaean manuscripts have come to light. Everyone finds their own revelation in them. For scientists, they are fragments of the Book of Life. For mystics, they are the key to a mystery. For ordinary people, they are the voice of a bygone era. How can we explain the power of a Manichaean phrase that has echoed through the millennia? Why, even now, after 2500 years, does it give us a sense of the immortality of knowledge? Let's ignite the fire of inquiry. What if the lines of the Book of the Living can change our understanding of how to liberate the light within ourselves? In the following chapters, we will delve into the details of the great persecutions, learn why Manichaean books were considered the most dangerous weapon in many countries, and what this meant for the fate of the faith itself. As soon as Manichaeism made itself known, a wave of persecution began that shook the East. The Zoroastrian priests, who guarded the traditions of Persia, considered Mani's teachings a threat to the unity of the empire. Persecution began. Arrests, public executions, burning of manuscripts, deportations. The prophet Mani faced trials head-on. Did he believe that the word was stronger than the sword? What did he feel when his friends were sent to prison and the Manichaean temples were destroyed in full view of everyone? The history of the East is a chronicle of continuous struggle, and Manichaeism found itself drawn into a complex political game. Kings were torn between religious renewal and the fear of losing control. Some autocrats, such as King Shapur, temporarily felt the power of Manichaean teachings, but the official faith always prevailed. Mani survived not only persecution, but also execution, described in legend as a trial by fire and molten metal. Yet even death could not erase the memory of him from the hearts of his disciples. Where are the traces of those persecutions today? In excavations of the remains of palaces and crypts, archaeologists find evidence of secret resistance. Manuscripts written on scraps of cloth, hidden symbols on the walls. Manichaean communities went underground, spreading their teachings on the fringes of the empire, living under false names. This fear of light and darkness has survived in Eastern cultures to this day. What should a person do when caught between the hammer of authority and the anvil of their own conscience? Is it possible to stand firm when the whole world is against you? In the next chapter, we will see how Manichaeism faced a new challenge, an encounter with the Christian West, and why this encounter turned into a new, even more brutal drama. Faced with Manichaean teachings, the Christian Church reacted with a severity that had not been seen before. The first anti-Manichaean decree was issued during the reign of Emperor Diocletian, and in the following centuries, new laws prohibited any dissemination of Mani's teachings, considering them a threat to the unity of the new imperial religion. How can we explain such fear of the Manichaeans? Why even the Church Fathers themselves saw in Mani's dualism not just heresy, but an attempt to destroy the foundations of the world. During the formation of Christian dogma, Manichaeism was persecuted particularly harshly. Bonfires burned in the center of Rome, books were burned, and thousands of people were sent into exile or executed. But even in these conditions, Mani's teachings attracted spiritual seekers and gave hope to those who did not find truth in dogma. Some prominent Christians, such as Augustine of Hippo, were Manichaeans in their youth and then spent their entire lives yearning for the mystery of light and darkness. The influence of Manichaeism spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Spain, Gaul. Secret communities appeared in every region. The struggle became total, not only religious, but also political, cultural, and philosophical. Who would withstand the pressure of the authorities? Who would keep the faith despite the threat of death? Manichaean treatises were interpreted in different ways, but the essence of their mission remained a mystery. Did Manichaeism really not fit into the structure of the European world? Perhaps its philosophical ideas were too profound to be understood and accepted. In the following chapters, we will see how Manichaeism managed to penetrate beyond the borders of world empires, cross boundaries, and find its way into the hearts of people where it was not expected. Manichaeism did not remain within the Mediterranean world and the Persian lands. It spread rapidly to the east, reaching the most remote territories of Central Asia and China. This path lay through deserts, mountain passes, and ancient cities of the Silk Road, where Manichaean missionaries met merchants, warriors, wanderers, and seekers of truth. Why was it in the East that Manichaeism found a second wind, becoming one of the most influential religions in the region for several centuries? What attracted the inhabitants of Sogdiana, Turfan, and Dunhuang to the teachings of light and darkness, so far removed from their traditional beliefs? The history of Eastern Manichaeism begins with the courageous missionaries who set out on the caravan routes to the east in the 3rd century AD. Among them were disciples of Mani himself, carrying sacred texts in Aramaic, Parthian, and Sogdian. These travelers established communities in desert oases, where Manichaean ideas were organically woven into the local spiritual tradition. Surprisingly, in China, Manichaeism was given the name the religion of the Buddha of Light. This was how the local people tried to make sense of the unfamiliar teachings through the Buddhist images familiar to them. Does this not indicate that the truth of light is capable of taking on different forms while retaining its essence? In the 8th century, Manichaeism reached an unprecedented peak in the Uyghur Khaganate, where it was proclaimed the state religion. Imagine, an entire powerful state adopted Mani's teachings as the basis of its spiritual life. Uyghur rulers built magnificent Manichaean temples, copied sacred books, and created works of art glorifying the struggle between light and darkness. For 5 centuries, from the 8th to the 12th century, Manichaeism remained the spiritual core of Uyghur civilization. But why did this glorious era come to an end? What happened to the Manichaean communities when the political map of the region changed? Archaeological discoveries in the 20th century shed light on this mystery. German expeditions to the Turfan oasis between 1902 and 1916 discovered thousands of fragments of Manichaean manuscripts in Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, Uyghur, and Chinese. These finds caused a sensation. For the first time, scholars had access to authentic Manichaean texts, rather than just the polemical writings of their opponents. Fragments of the Shaparakan, the Gospel of Mani, psalms and hymns made it possible to reconstruct the full picture of Manichaean spirituality. Every scrap of papyrus, every line on decayed parchment became a key to unraveling a great mystery. The Manichaean manuscripts from Dunhuang, acquired by British archaeologist Aurel Stein and French sinologist Paul Pelliot in 1907 and 1908, opened another page of history. Among the finds, a text entitled A Brief Summary of the Teachings and Rules of the Religion of Buddha of Light. Mani stood out, the first half of which was in Stein's possession and the second in Pelliot's. This Chinese language work became a bridge between two civilizations, showing how Manichaeism adapted to local conditions while retaining its essence. Isn't it amazing that 1/500 years after Mani's death, his words continue to resonate from the depths of centuries? Eastern Manichaeism left an indelible mark on the culture of the peoples of Central Asia. Manichaean motifs penetrated the literature, art, and philosophy of the region. Even after the disappearance of organized communities, the ideas of the struggle between light and darkness continued to live on in the folk memory, in tales and legends. Today, scholars continue to study the Turfan finds, discovering new facets of Manichaean teaching. Each study brings us closer to understanding what Manichaeism really was. Was it just a religion, or something more? A universal path to spiritual liberation? In the next chapter, we will learn how Manichaeism faced a new challenge: the rise of Islam and its relentless onslaught on all other beliefs. Were the Manichaeans able to survive under the rule of the Caliphate, or was their fate sealed? What awaited the teachings of Mani in the Muslim world? The emergence of Islam in the 7th century was a turning point for Manichaeism in the Middle East and Central Asia. The new religion, spreading rapidly under the banner of jihad, tolerated no competition and demanded that the conquered peoples either convert to Islam or accept the status of people of the book and pay a special tax. The Manichaeans, recognized as neither Christians nor Zoroastrians, found themselves in a particularly vulnerable position. What was the fate of Mani's followers under the rule of the Caliphate? Could they find a place in the New World Order? Or were they doomed to complete destruction? Initially, Islamic rulers showed a certain tolerance towards the Manichaeans, considering them to be one of the many sects in the region. Manichaean communities continued to exist in the major cities of the Caliphate: Baghdad, Basra, Damascus, albeit under constant pressure. The Manichaeans paid the jizya tax, avoided public displays of their faith, and met in secret to read sacred texts and perform rituals. But with each passing decade, the situation became increasingly threatening. Islamic theologians declared Manichaeism to be Zindikism, a dangerous heresy that must be eradicated. Why did Muslim scholars fight so fiercely against the Manichaeans? What in the doctrine of light and darkness posed a threat to Islam? The answer lies in the very nature of Manichaean dualism. Islam preaches strict monotheism. There is only one God, Allah, and all evil in the world comes not from an independent evil principle, but from people's disobedience to the will of the Almighty. Manichaean teaching, on the other hand, affirms the existence of two equal primordial forces, light and darkness, which, from the point of view of Islam, is an unacceptable distortion of the truth. In addition, the Manichaean view of the material world as a creation of darkness contradicted the Islamic view of the world as a good creation of Allah. These fundamental differences made Manichaeism incompatible with Islam and doomed its followers to persecution. In the 9th century, Caliph al-Mahdi launched a systematic campaign against the Zindiks, i.e., the Manichaeans. Special tribunals were set up to identify and punish the followers of Mani. Thousands of people were executed, their property confiscated, and their families enslaved. Manichaean books were burned en masse. The authorities understood that destroying the texts meant destroying the very memory of the teachings. Imagine the squares of the Baghdad bazaars, where ancient manuscripts are burning on bonfires, and the crowd watches this spectacle with approval or indifference. How much invaluable knowledge was lost in that fire? What revelations disappeared forever from human history? Despite the brutal persecution, Manichaeism did not disappear overnight. Communities went underground, moving to the outskirts of the caliphate, where the authorities' control was weaker. Some Manichaeans outwardly accepted Islam while continuing to secretly practice their faith, a practice known as taqiyya. Others fled eastward to the Uyghur lands, where Manichaeism still flourished under the protection of the Khagans. Still others dissolved into various Islamic sects, bringing elements of Manichaean dualism with them. Traces of this influence can be found in the teachings of some Shiite and Sufi movements, where ideas about the struggle between light and darkness, hidden knowledge, and spiritual liberation echo the Manichaean tradition. By the 11th century, Manichaeism had virtually disappeared from the Islamic world. The last references to Manichaean communities in Arab sources date back to the 10th and 11th centuries. After that, silence ensued. A great religion, once widespread from the Atlantic to the Pacific, became a memory, a subject of academic debate among Muslim theologians. But did it disappear without a trace? Or did the seeds sown by Mani continue to sprout in other forms, under other names? Perhaps the truth about light and darkness is too profound to be destroyed by fire and sword? In the next chapter, we will turn to the present day and learn how the archaeological discoveries of the 20th century brought Manichaeism back from oblivion, allowing the voice of this lost religion to be heard after centuries of silence. The 20th century was an era of great archaeological discoveries that literally resurrected Manichaeism from oblivion. After many centuries, when Mani's teachings were known only from the hostile testimonies of Christian and Muslim authors, researchers gained access to authentic Manichaean texts. These findings completely changed our understanding of Manichaeism, transforming it from a mythical heresy into a real religious system with its own philosophy, ethics, cosmology, and spiritual practices. How did this miraculous resurrection happen? Where and under what circumstances were the treasures of Manichaean literature discovered? The first wave of discoveries came at the beginning of the 20th century and was linked to German expeditions to the Turfan oasis in the Chinese province of Xinjiang. From 1902 to 1916, 4 expeditions from the Berlin Ethnographic Museum, led by Albert Grunewedel and other researchers, explored the ruins of ancient cities along the Silk Road. In the ruins of Kocho, once a thriving center of Uyghur civilization, archaeologists discovered wall paintings depicting people in white robes, Manichaean priests. Nearby were fragments of manuscripts written in various scripts, including Estrangelo, Middle Persian, and Uyghur alphabets. When the finds were brought to Berlin, their study was entrusted to Friedrich Wilhelm Karl Müller, an outstanding linguist who knew Arabic, Persian, and Far Eastern languages. The deciphering of the texts caused a sensation. They were excerpts from the Manichaean Gospel, fragments of the Shapurkan, and other sacred books of Manichaeism. For the first time since the persecution, humanity had the opportunity to hear the voice of Mani himself, unclouded by the polemics of his opponents. Imagine the moment when a scientist reads lines written 150 years ago for the first time, and realizes that he is holding the key to the greatest mystery. What did Müller feel when he realized the scale of his discovery? Parallel to the Turfan finds, other researchers were working in Dunhuang, where British archaeologist Aurel Stein and French sinologist Paul Pelliot acquired thousands of ancient manuscripts from a sealed cave library in 1907 and 1908. Among the Buddhist and Taoist texts were Manichaean writings in Chinese, including the famous Brief Summary of the Teachings and Rules of the Religion of Buddha of Light, Mani. This text, probably translated from the Parthian language, provided a systematic exposition of Manichaean teachings in a form adapted for a Chinese audience. A comparison of the Turfan and Dunhuang finds allowed scholars to reconstruct the history of the spread of Manichaeism in Central Asia and China. But the most dramatic discoveries awaited archaeologists in Egypt. In 1929, an entire library of Manichaean texts in Coptic was discovered in Medinet Madi, an ancient settlement in the Fayum oasis. 7 codices contained psalms, hymns, sermons, and historical narratives of the Manichaean community in Egypt. These texts provided a unique opportunity to understand how Manichaeism functioned in practice, what rituals were performed, what prayers were recited, and how relationships were built between the elect and the listeners, 2 categories of believers. Although 4 of the 7 codices were lost or damaged during World War II, the remaining ones continue to be studied and published to this day. Even more significant was the discovery in 1969 of the so-called Cologne Codex, a miniature manuscript measuring only 3.5 by 4.5 centimeters, containing a biography of Mani in Greek. This document, dated to the 5th or 6th century, is based on the testimonies of the prophet's direct disciples and recounts his childhood, youth, first revelations, missionary journeys, and martyrdom. The Cologne Codex became a kind of Gospel of the Manichaeans, providing a historical basis for understanding the personality of the founder of the religion. The last major discovery took place in the 1990s, in the Egyptian oasis of Dakhla, where excavations of the Roman village of Kelis uncovered manuscripts attesting to the existence of a thriving Manichaean community there at the end of the 4th century. The documents included not only religious texts, but also private letters, business records, and economic documents, everything that allows us to reconstruct the daily life of the Manichaeans. These findings showed that Manichaeism was not an abstract philosophical system, but a living religion with real people, their joys, sufferings, hopes, and fears. All these discoveries together revolutionized the study of Manichaeism. From the shadows of oblivion emerged an entire civilization with its own culture, art, literature, and spiritual practices. Scholars were able to compare data from different regions and eras, trace the evolution of the doctrine, and understand the reasons for its success and tragic disappearance. But most importantly, humanity once again heard Mani's message about light and darkness, about the path to liberation of the soul, about the cosmic drama of salvation. Is this not a sign that some truths are too important to disappear forever? In the next chapter, we will take a closer look at the content of the found texts and learn what revelations they brought to modern researchers of Manichaeism. What did the manuscripts tell us about the teachings of Manichaeism? What revelations were contained in the texts that had been hidden from humanity for 1,500 years? The deciphering and translation of the Manichaean documents became a grand scientific project involving dozens of scholars from different countries. Philologists, historians, religious scholars, and specialists in ancient languages all contributed to recreating the picture of Manichaean spirituality. With each translated fragment, with each deciphered line, the world of Manichaeism opened up in all its complexity and depth. 7 books written by Mani himself occupy a central place in Manichaean literature. These are the Gospel of the Living, the Treasury of Life, the Pragmatia, the Book of Secrets, the Book of Giants, the Epistles, and the Shaparakan. Each of these books had its own purpose. Some expounded on Manichaean cosmology and mythology, others contained ethical teachings, and still others represented polemics with other religions. Unfortunately, none of these books have survived in their entirety. We only have fragments scattered among various archaeological finds. But even these fragments allow us to form a fairly complete picture of Manichaean teaching. According to Manichaean texts, at the beginning of time there were 2 independent kingdoms, the kingdom of light in the north and the kingdom of darkness in the south. The kingdom of light was inhabited by benevolent divine beings led by the Father of Greatness, while the kingdom of darkness was full of demonic forces ruled by the Prince of Darkness. Initially, these 2 kingdoms did not interact, but one day the forces of darkness saw the light and desired to capture it. A cosmic war began, during which part of the light was captured by darkness and imprisoned in the material world. The entire visible cosmos, stars, planets, earth, plants, animals, people, is a mixture of light and darkness, an arena of their never-ending struggle. According to Manichaean teaching, man is a microcosm of this universal drama. The human soul is a particle of light imprisoned in the dungeon of the material body. The goal of human life is to free this particle, purify it from the defilement of matter, and return it to the kingdom of light. This can only be achieved through gnosis, spiritual knowledge that reveals to a person the truth about their nature and purpose. But gnosis alone is not enough. Strict ascetic practices are also necessary, including abstinence from meat, wine, sexual relations, violence, and lies. The Manichaeans were divided into 2 classes: the elect, who observed all the commandments in full, and the hearers, who supported the elect and prepared to join their ranks in the next life. The doctrine of saviors occupies a special place in Manichaean doctrine. Manichaeans believed that throughout history, the kingdom of light had sent various prophets and teachers into the world to reveal the truth to people and show them the way to liberation. Among these saviors, the Manichaeans named Adam, Seth, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Zarathustra, Buddha, and Jesus. Mani considered himself the last and greatest of this line of prophets, the one who brought the final and complete revelation. In this sense, Manichaeism claimed to be a universal world religion, synthesizing the best of all previous traditions. Manichaean eschatology paints a dramatic picture of the end of time. When all particles of light are freed from the captivity of matter, a final separation will occur. Light will return to its kingdom, and darkness will be forever confined within its boundaries, unable to threaten the good anymore. The material world will cease to exist, for it was only a temporary arena for cosmic struggle. Saved souls will unite with the Father of greatness in eternal bliss, while unrepentant sinners will share the fate of darkness. This is not so much a punishment as a natural consequence of the choices made by a person during their lifetime. The study of Manichaean texts has also revealed a rich ritual practice. Manichaeans performed daily prayers addressed to the sun and moon as visible manifestations of light. They fasted, refrained from defiling nature, and practiced confession and repentance. Of particular importance was the meal of the elect, during which listeners brought food to the elect, and those who tasted it contributed to the liberation of the particles of light contained in plants. There were also hymns and psalms, many of which have come down to us in Coptic and Middle Persian manuscripts. These texts are striking in their poetic beauty and depth of spiritual feeling. Reading Manichaean texts leaves a strong impression. Even across the gulf of time and cultural differences, one senses the sincerity of their author's faith, their striving for purity, their hope for liberation. Manichaeism appears not as an exotic heresy, but as a serious attempt to answer the eternal questions about the nature of evil, the meaning of suffering, and the path to salvation. Perhaps this is why it frightened the authorities so much. After all, people who have found inner light no longer need external authorities, do they? In the next chapter, we will turn to the tragic end of the history of Manichaeism and try to understand why this religion disappeared, despite its appeal and widespread popularity. By the end of the first millennium, Manichaeism, once widespread from the Atlantic to the Pacific, was on the verge of extinction. What happened? Why did a religion that had survived centuries of persecution and managed to adapt to a wide variety of cultural environments ultimately fail? The answer to this question is complex and multi-layered. External factors played a role here: systematic persecution by state and religious authorities, internal problems within Manichaean communities, and general historical processes that changed the map of the religious world. The main factor in the decline of Manichaeism was the combined pressure of three great religions: Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Islam. Each of them saw Manichaeism not simply as a competitor, but as a dangerous heresy threatening the very foundations of their faith. The Christian Church fought Manichaeism as a dualistic heresy that rejected the creation of the world by a good God. The Zoroastrian priesthood of Persia saw Mani's teachings as a distortion of the ancient tradition of Zarathustra and a threat to the state religion. Islam considered Manichaeans to be Zoroastrians, polytheists, deserving of death. Under the triple blow of these religions, which had the support of state power, Manichaean communities ceased to exist one after another. But persecution alone does not explain the complete disappearance of Manichaeism. After all, other persecuted religions, such as Judaism or various Christian sects, managed to survive by going underground or migrating to more tolerant regions. Why were the Manichaeans unable to do the same? Perhaps the reason lies in the specific nature of Manichaean teaching. Manichaeism was a religion of the book in the literal sense. Its existence depended on the availability of sacred texts, which had to be copied and studied. The systematic destruction of Manichaean manuscripts deprived the community of its spiritual foundation. Without books, Manichaeism lost its identity, turning into a vague tradition unable to withstand external pressure. Another problem was the elitism of Manichaeism. The division into the elect and the listeners created a hierarchy in which complete salvation was available only to the few who were able to observe the strictest ascetic rules. For the masses, Manichaeism remained too demanding, too intellectual, too far removed from everyday life. Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, despite their differences, offered a path to salvation that was accessible to every believer. Manichaeism, on the other hand, required special knowledge, special discipline, and a special way of life, which limited the circle of its followers. The geographical distribution of Manichaean communities also played a role. Manichaeism was never the state religion of a large and long-lasting empire, except for a brief period in the Uyghur Khaganate. The communities were scattered across vast territories, often isolated from each other and lacking a single center of leadership. When persecution intensified in one region, the Manichaeans could not count on help from fellow believers in other areas. Each community was left to fend for itself, and so their destruction took place gradually, methodically, community by community, region by region. By the 12th century, the last organized Manichaean communities in Central Asia had ceased to exist. The Mongol conquests and the subsequent Islamization of the region finally erased all traces of this religion. Individual Manichaeans may have remained here and there, but Manichaeism ceased to exist as a coherent religious system. Silence fell. The silence after the bonfire that burned books, temples, and the hopes of millions of believers. It seemed that Mani's teachings had disappeared forever, becoming merely a topic for scholarly debate and historical research. But the history of religions knows many examples when ideas that seem to have been lost forever are revived in new forms, under new names, in changed circumstances. Did Manichaeism really disappear without a trace? Or did its ideas continue to live on, woven into the fabric of other religious movements, influencing philosophy, literature, and art? Perhaps the dualism of light and darkness is too fundamental to the human experience to be destroyed by fire and sword. In the next chapter, we will trace how Manichaean ideas influenced medieval Europe, giving rise to a series of heretical movements that the Church called New Manichaeans. Are you ready to learn that the teachings of Mani may not have died, but only changed their form? Although organized Manichaeism had disappeared by the 12th century, its ideas lived on in the European heretical movements of the Middle Ages. The Cathars in southern France, the Bogomils in the Balkans, the Paulicians in Asia Minor. All these groups shared a dualistic worldview strikingly reminiscent of the Manichaean teachings of light and darkness. Were they direct heirs of Manichaeism, or did they independently arrive at similar conclusions? This question is still debated by historians, but the connection between medieval dualism and the Manichaean tradition seems undeniable. The Bogomil movement originated in Bulgaria in the 10th century and quickly spread throughout the Balkan Peninsula and further into Western Europe. The Bogomils taught about the existence of two principles: the good God, who created the spiritual world, and the evil demiurge Satanael, who created the material cosmos. According to Bogomil teaching, man is the result of this dual creation. His soul comes from God, his body from Satanael. The path to salvation lies through the rejection of the material, through asceticism and spiritual knowledge. The Bogomils rejected the church hierarchy, the sacraments, the veneration of icons and relics, seeing in all this a service to the material world. Doesn't all this sound surprisingly familiar to those who have studied Manichaeism? An even more striking similarity can be found in the Cathars, a dualistic sect that flourished in southern France and northern Italy in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Cathars, or pure ones, were divided into perfect ones, who observed strict asceticism, and ordinary believers, who supported the perfect ones and hoped to join their ranks in time. This structure is almost identical to the Manichaean division into elect and hearers. The Cathars taught about the transmigration of souls, the need to free the spiritual principle from the captivity of matter, and the evil inherent in physical existence. They had their own sacred texts, performed rituals, and created an alternative church organization with bishops and deacons. The Catholic Church perceived the Cathars as a mortal threat. At the beginning of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III called for a crusade against the heretics of Languedoc. The Albigensian Wars, which lasted from 1209 to 1229, led to the mass extermination of the Cathar population. Cities were burned, and thousands of men, women, and children were killed. The famous phrase attributed to the papal legate Arnaud Aimery, "Kill them all, God will recognize his own," reflects the fanaticism with which the struggle against dualistic heresy was waged. By the end of the 13th century, Catharism had been virtually destroyed, although isolated communities continued to exist in mountainous areas for several more decades. The connection between the Cathars and Manichaeism has long been a subject of debate. Medieval Catholic polemicists directly called the Cathars Manichaeans, but modern researchers have been more cautious. There is no direct documentary evidence of the transfer of teachings from Manichaean communities to European heretics. However, the ideological similarity is so obvious that it is difficult to assume complete independence. It is likely that Manichaean ideas penetrated Europe through various channels, through Bogomil preaching, through contacts with Eastern Christians, and through written sources preserved in monastic libraries. Dualism, once formulated by Mani, proved to be such a powerful and attractive idea that it continued to be revived in various forms and in different eras. The influence of the Manichaean tradition can also be found in other areas of medieval culture. The legends of the Grail, with their themes of spiritual quest and the confrontation between light and darkness, echo dualistic thought. The troubadours of Provence, many of whom sympathized with the Cathars, extolled courtly love as a path to spiritual elevation above gross matter. Even in Catholic mysticism, one can find elements reminiscent of the Manichaean understanding of the soul as a spark of divine light imprisoned in the dungeon of the flesh. The persecution of dualistic heresies led to the creation of the Inquisition, a special ecclesiastical institution whose task was to identify and eradicate heresy. The methods of the Inquisition, torture, burning at the stake, confiscation of property, were directed not only against the Cathars, but against anyone who dared to deviate from orthodox teaching. In this sense, the fight against new Manichaeism had a profound impact on European history, contributing to the strengthening of church power, but also creating an atmosphere of fear and intolerance. By the 14th century, organized Catharism had disappeared, just as Manichaeism had disappeared several centuries earlier. But the very idea of dualism, the idea of a fundamental opposition between good and evil, light and darkness, spirit and matter, proved indestructible. It continued to live on in philosophical systems, literary works, and popular beliefs. Perhaps this suggests that the Manichaean view of the world corresponds to something deeply rooted in the human consciousness, a kind of basic experience of the contradiction between high and low, between ideal and reality. In the next chapter, we will try to understand what makes Manichaean teaching relevant even today, almost 2,000 years after Mani's death. Is it possible that the ancient religion of light and darkness has something important to say to modern man? What can be gleaned from Manichaean teachings today, when Mani's organized religion has long since disappeared and only fragments of its texts remain? Does Manichaean dualism have any significance for modern man, or is it just a curious historical artifact of interest only to specialists? Let's try to look at Mani's teachings not as a dead dogma of the past, but as a living attempt to answer the eternal questions that have preoccupied people throughout the ages. At the heart of the Manichaean worldview lies the problem of evil. Where does evil come from? Why is the world full of suffering, injustice, and violence? Why do good intentions often lead to bad results? Why does a person who strives for good repeatedly commit evil? These questions tormented ancient philosophers, occupy the minds of modern thinkers, and trouble every person capable of reflection. The Manichaean answer is radical. Evil exists because it is an independent cosmic force, as primordial and real as good. Good and evil are not different degrees of the same reality, but represent two incompatible principles fighting for dominance over the world and the human soul. This understanding has its advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, Manichaean dualism explains why evil is so persistent and powerful. It is not simply the absence of good, not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but an active force with its own existence and will. This allows us to take evil seriously, not to underestimate its danger, not to reassure ourselves with illusions that everything will work out somehow. Manichaeism calls for struggle, for a conscious choice of the side of light, for tireless efforts to free good from the captivity of evil. There is heroism in this, there is drama, there is recognition of the reality of conflict. On the other hand, the absolutization of dualism creates problems. If light and darkness are equal and equivalent, then where does the confidence in the ultimate victory of light come from? Manichaean eschatology promises the separation of the two principles at the end of time, but the logic of the teaching does not provide grounds for such optimism. Moreover, dualism can lead to contempt for the material world, to asceticism bordering on hatred of the body and life. If everything material is created by darkness, then family, society, culture, civilization, all of this belongs to the dark principle and must be rejected. History has shown that such a position makes religion elitist, inaccessible to the majority, and ultimately unviable. Nevertheless, Manichaean teaching contains an important truth. Evil is real. The conflict between good and evil is fundamental, and every person is an arena for this struggle. Modern psychology, especially Carl Gustav Jung's depth psychology, has come to similar conclusions. Jung spoke of the shadow, the dark side of the personality that contains repressed desires, fears, and aggressive impulses. Integrating the shadow, acknowledging its existence, and working with it is a necessary condition for psychological maturity. Denial of the shadow leads to projection, when a person sees evil everywhere around them, but not in themselves. In this sense, the Manichaean understanding of the struggle between light and darkness in the human soul turns out to be psychologically accurate and relevant. Another important aspect of Manichaeism is its emphasis on gnosis, on knowledge as the path to salvation. The Manichaeans claim that a person suffers primarily from ignorance of their true nature. If everyone realized that they are a particle of divine light imprisoned in the material world, their life would change radically. They would cease to identify themselves with their body, their social role, their transient desires and fears. They would become free from the fear of death, from the thirst for possession, from dependence on external circumstances. This knowledge is not intellectual information, but a profound insight that transforms the whole being of a person. Contemporary spirituality, especially in its non-dogmatic forms, often speaks of something similar. The ideas of awakening, enlightenment, and awareness all echo Manichaean Gnosticism. The difference is that modern teachings do not usually give this knowledge a cosmological scale, nor do they connect it with the myth of the fall of light into darkness. But the very intuition that a person is more than their everyday I, that something deep and bright is hidden within them, that the path to happiness lies through self-knowledge. This intuition connects Manichaeism with modern spiritual quests. Finally, Manichaean ethics, with its emphasis on nonviolence, honesty, and abstinence from harming nature, sounds surprisingly modern. Manichaeans refused to eat meat so as not to participate in the killing of living beings. They treated plants with care, seeing in them particles of light. They preached peace and rejected war. In an era of ecological crisis and the search for a sustainable way of life, these principles are gaining new relevance. Of course, the Manichaean motivation was different. They cared not so much about nature itself as about the light contained within it. But the result is similar: a respectful, non-violent attitude toward all living things. Can we call ourselves Manichaeans today? Hardly. Too much in their teaching is unacceptable to the modern mind. Cosmological myth, literally understood dualism, extreme asceticism. But can we learn from Manichaeism, draw insights from it that are applicable to our lives? Absolutely. A serious attitude toward the problem of evil, the search for inner knowledge, the ethics of nonviolence and care for the world. All this remains relevant. Manichaeism reminds us that the spiritual path requires effort, that truth does not lie on the surface, that liberation is possible but requires determination and discipline. In the next chapter, we will look at how ideas related to Manichaeism manifest themselves in contemporary culture, philosophy, and esoteric traditions. Perhaps the light of Mani continues to shine, albeit in unexpected forms. If organized Manichaeism has disappeared, ideas close to Mani's teachings continue to live on in various esoteric traditions, philosophical systems, and cultural phenomena. Gnosticism, Kabbalah, alchemy, Rosicrucianism, theosophy. All these movements, each in its own way, develop themes familiar from Manichaean texts: the fall of the divine principle into matter, the need for its liberation, esoteric knowledge as the path to salvation, the cosmic drama of light and darkness. Is there a direct historical connection between these traditions and Manichaeism? Or is this a case of independent parallel development of similar ideas? The connection between Manichaeism and Gnosticism is most obvious. Both movements arose at about the same time and in the same region, the Middle East of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Both shared a dualistic worldview, although Gnostic dualism was generally less radical than Manichaean dualism. Both taught about gnosis, the saving knowledge of the true nature of man and the cosmos. Both were critical of the material world and physical existence. Mani himself was familiar with Gnostic literature and was influenced by it, although he created an original system that differed from the Gnostic schools. After the disappearance of organized Manichaeism, Gnostic ideas continued to live on in various forms. Some Christian mystics, while formally remaining within the bounds of orthodoxy, developed teachings that were strikingly similar to Gnostic and Manichaean ones. Meister Eckhart, with his idea of the spark of the soul, Jacob Boehme with his theosophy, Nicholas of Cusa with his philosophy of the coincidence of opposites, all of them, consciously or unconsciously, continued to develop themes first clearly, formulated by the Gnostics and Manichaeans. During the Renaissance, interest in ancient Gnosticism was revived, and ideas about the divine nature of man, the need for spiritual transformation, and hidden knowledge became part of the European esoteric tradition. Alchemy occupies a special place in this chain of continuity. Outwardly, alchemy was concerned with the transformation of metals, but for the initiated, it was a symbol of an inner process of transformation. The transformation of the lead of ordinary consciousness into the gold of an enlightened state. Alchemical work was described as the liberation of the spiritual principle from the captivity of matter. Doesn't that sound Manichaean? Alchemists spoke of prima materia, the first matter that must be purified and elevated, and of the philosopher's stone, capable of effecting this transformation. Jung, who studied alchemical symbolism, saw in it a psychological map of the process of individuation, the integration of the conscious and the unconscious, light and shadow within the psyche. The connection between alchemy and Manichaeism is not direct, but typological. Both traditions see in matter something that requires transformation, redemption, and elevation. In the 19th and 20th centuries, with the growth of interest in esotericism and occultism, Manichaean motifs reappeared in the works of theosophists, anthroposophists, and Gnostic societies. Helena Blavatsky, in The Secret Doctrine, repeatedly mentions Mani and Manichaeism as part of a single chain of ancient wisdom stretching from the Atlanteans to the present day. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, saw Manichaeism as an attempt to solve the problem of evil through its knowledge and transformation, rather than through simple denial. For Steiner, Christ was a cosmic healer, healing evil from within, and Manichaeism was a premonition of this truth, albeit expressed in the limited forms of ancient mythology. In contemporary popular culture, the dualism of light and darkness has become a virtually universal theme. From Star Wars with its force and dark side to countless fantasy novels where heroes battle against a dark overlord, we see echoes of the Manichaean cosmic drama everywhere. Of course, the creators of these works are most often unfamiliar with Mani's teachings and do not consciously reproduce his ideas. But the very stability of this mythological structure speaks to something important. Apparently, the idea of the struggle between two principles, the idea that the world is an arena of confrontation between good and evil, and that every person must choose a side, is deeply rooted in the human psyche. 20th century philosophy also did not ignore themes close to Manichaeism. Existentialists, Camus, Sartre, Heidegger, spoke of man's abandonment in the world, of his original alienation from true being. This theme, although expressed in secular terms, echoes the Manichaean teaching about the exiled soul, which finds itself in a material cosmos alien to it. The difference is that existentialists did not believe in the possibility of returning home. For them, freedom consisted in recognizing the absurdity of existence and heroically creating oneself in spite of it. But the very feeling of rupture, alienation, and incongruity between what is and what should be, this feeling connects existentialism with Manichaean intuition. Can we say that there is a continuous secret tradition leading from Mani through the Gnostics, alchemists, and Cathars to modern esoteric movements? Historical science is rather skeptical. There is no direct evidence of such continuity. But in the history of ideas, it is not only the direct transmission of texts and teachings that is important. Typological parallels, the independent revival of similar intuitions in different cultures and eras, are also important. Manichaeism formulated a certain type of spirituality: dualistic, Gnostic, ascetic, oriented toward liberation through knowledge. This type proved so powerful and attractive that it continues to be reproduced again and again, even when no one remembers Manichaeism itself. In this sense, we can speak not so much of the secret continuity of organizations and texts as of the continuity of spiritual experience, the experience of inner division, the struggle of opposing principles in the soul, the thirst for liberation from the bonds of materiality, the search for hidden knowledge capable of transforming existence. This experience is universal. Mani gave it systematic expression, creating a mythology and cosmology that explain this experience. But the experience itself existed before Mani and continues to exist after him. In this sense, Manichaeism has not died. It has merely entered a latent state, from which it periodically revives in new forms when historical circumstances favor a dualistic perception of the world. What does this tell us about the nature of religious ideas? Perhaps some of them are so fundamental that they cannot be destroyed by any persecution. They are rooted not in books and institutions, but in the very structure of human consciousness, in the basic dilemmas of existence. Manichaeism is one of the most vivid expressions of such a fundamental idea, and as long as people feel the conflict between ideal and reality, between spirit and flesh, between light and darkness in their own souls, Mani's teachings will remain relevant, even if no one calls themselves a Manichaean. In the last concluding chapter, we will return to the beginning of our narrative and try to answer the question: what does the return of Manichaeism from oblivion mean for us today? What lessons can be learned from the history of this amazing religion? And isn't this history itself a metaphor? A metaphor for the light of knowledge that cannot be completely extinguished by the darkness of oblivion? We have come a long way, from the first revelations of the young Mani on the banks of the Euphrates to the archaeological discoveries of the 20th century that brought Manichaeism back from oblivion. What have we learned? What conclusions can be drawn from this history? The history of a religion that once spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but then disappeared, leaving only fragments of texts and memories in legends. And most importantly, why today, almost 2,000 years after Mani's death, is this topic once again attracting the attention of scholars, writers, and spiritual seekers? The return of Manichaeism began with archaeology, but continues in completely different fields: philosophy, psychology, literature, even politics. In the 21st century, humanity is once again acutely aware of the dualism of existence. The conflict between technological progress and the ecological crisis, between globalization and the preservation of cultural identity, between individual freedom and social order, all these contradictions bring to mind the ancient intuition of light and darkness. The world is once again seen as an arena of struggle between opposing forces, and the question of how to find the path to light is being asked with renewed urgency. Modern research into Manichaeism continues. Every year, new translations of discovered texts are published, monographs are released, and conferences are held. Manichaeism is no longer a marginal topic for narrow specialists, but has become part of the general cultural discourse. Universities are offering courses on the history of Manichaeism, museums are organizing exhibitions of Manichaean art, and documentary films are telling the story of Mani's life and teachings. Why is this happening now? Perhaps because our era, like the time of Mani, is an era of spiritual searching, an era of doubt in traditional answers, an era of thirst for new or well-forgotten old truths. One of the most important lessons that can be learned from the history of Manichaeism concerns the nature of religious truth. The Manichaeans believe that there is a single original truth that has been revealed to different peoples throughout history through different prophets. Buddha, Zarathustra, Jesus, Mani, all of them, according to Manichaean teaching, preached the same truth, albeit in forms adapted to specific cultural conditions. This idea of religious pluralism, of tolerance for different traditions while maintaining faith in a single essential truth, sounds surprisingly modern. In a world torn apart by religious conflicts, the Manichaean model could serve as a basis for dialogue and mutual understanding. Another lesson relates to the question of evil. Manichaean dualism, for all its problems, has one undeniable merit. It takes evil seriously. Unlike teachings that explain evil as the absence of good, as an illusion or as a necessary step in the development toward perfection, Manichaeism recognizes that evil is real, powerful, and cannot be simply explained or justified. This honesty, this courage to face the dark side of existence, deserves respect. Of course, absolute dualism creates theological difficulties, but at least it does not try to sweep the problem under the rug. Manichaean ethics also has something to say to the modern world. The principles of nonviolence, vegetarianism, respect for nature, honesty, and abstinence are relevant in an era of ecological crisis and the search for a sustainable lifestyle. Of course, Manichaean motivation was specific. They wanted to liberate the particles of light imprisoned in matter. But the practical consequences of this motivation are surprisingly consistent with contemporary environmental and ethical movements. Perhaps it is not so important why we care for nature. What is important is that we do so. The history of the persecution of Manichaeism also teaches a lesson about the price of intolerance. The systematic destruction of Manichaean communities and texts was one of the first attempts at religious genocide in history. The Christian Church, the Zoroastrian priesthood, and the Islamic Caliphate all used state power to eradicate dissent. The result was not only the death of millions of people, but also the irreversible loss of cultural heritage. How much insight, how much wisdom, how much beauty was destroyed in the fires of the Inquisition? We will never know. The history of Manichaeism reminds us of the fragility of cultural memory and the need to protect pluralism of opinion and belief. But perhaps the most profound lesson of Manichaeism lies in the very fact of its return. For 1,500 years, Manichaeism was considered dead, wiped off the face of the earth. There were no living Manichaeans left, no active communities, no complete copies of sacred books. It seemed that the victory of the persecutors was absolute. But then, in the sands of Turfan and Dunhuang, in the Egyptian necropolises, fragments began to be found, and the voice of Mani was heard again. The dead religion came back to life, albeit in a new capacity, not as a practiced faith, but as an object of study, a source of inspiration, a reason to reflect on eternal questions. This return shows that once the truth is spoken, it can't be destroyed for good. It can be suppressed, forgotten, distorted, but sooner or later it comes back to the surface, demanding to be heard. In this sense, the history of Manichaeism is a story about the indestructibility of the light of knowledge. Darkness may reign for centuries, but a single discovery, a single ray of understanding, is enough to make it begin to recede. Archaeologists deciphering ancient texts are continuing Mani's own mission. They are freeing light from the captivity of oblivion, returning lost knowledge to humanity. What does the future hold for Manichaeism? It is unlikely to be revived as an organized religion. There are neither the social conditions nor the complete textual basis for this. But as a source of ideas, as a model for reflecting on fundamental questions of existence, as a reminder of the complexity and diversity of humanity's religious experience, in this capacity, Manichaeism will undoubtedly retain its significance. Perhaps new forms of dualistic spirituality will emerge in the future, drawing inspiration from the Manichaean heritage and adapting it to the conditions of the modern world. There is also a more radical possibility. What if the Manichaean view of the world turns out to be not just one of many religious systems, but an intuition of something deep and fundamental in the structure of reality? Modern physics speaks of the dualism of waves and particles, the opposition of matter and antimatter, the struggle between entropy and negentropy. Psychology discovers polarities in the structure of the psyche. Ethics faces insoluble dilemmas where good and evil are inseparable from each other. Perhaps dualism is not a historical misconception, overcome by a more mature monotheism, but a constant feature of our experience of the world? If so, then Manichaeism was not a mistake, but a vision ahead of its time. Concluding our journey through the history of Manichaeism, we return to the image with which we began, the image of light and darkness fighting for the human soul. This image has survived for millennia, enduring persecution and oblivion, and now it appears before us again, inviting reflection. Each of us is a Manichaean, in the sense that each of us feels the conflict between high and low, light and dark, within ourselves. Each of us faces the choice of which side to take in this internal battle, and each of us carries within ourselves a spark of light, the very light that Mani spoke of, the light of knowledge, compassion, and truth. Manichaeism disappeared as a religion, but it remained as a question addressed to each generation. What will you choose? Light or darkness? Are you ready for the difficult path to liberation? Or would you prefer the comfort of oblivion? Can you see the spark of the divine in yourself and in others, despite all the darkness and suffering in the world? There are no easy answers to these questions, but the very fact that we continue to ask them suggests that Mani's light has not been extinguished. It continues to burn in everyone who seeks the truth, in everyone who has not come to terms with evil, in everyone who believes in the possibility of liberation. And in this sense, Manichaeism is not dead. It is merely waiting for its hour to shine again upon the darkness of the world.